Hello everyone, this is Al Fadi and I'd like to welcome you back to our series on ISIS, Sharia law, and the ISIS phenomena. In other words, what is the relationship basically between the two? And this is part 2 of this series and the final one as well. Part 1 dealt with Sharia. This part 2, is going to deal with ISIS. And of course, we mentioned that there is a connection between the two, and simply the intent behind ISIS's movement or the likes of ISIS. This is why I called it ISIS phenomena, because you can call it anything you want. This is an Islamic Reformation movement. You can call it ultra-conservative Reformation movement. In other words, a movement that wants to bring the Muslim world back to the model of the 7th century Islam. And when in doing so, Sharia law becomes very essential because it's living under the Islamic law. In the minds of ISIS, Muslims in general are not being faithful to Sharia law. They're not living purely under Sharia law. And even in some areas, they consider the laws that are being practiced, even though they call them Sharia law, they're not purely Sharia based on the judgment and interpretation of the Prophet of Islam. So if ISIS attacks Saudi or if ISIS attacks Iran, they're doing this simply because they believe both of these countries are not practicing Sharia law according to ISIS's own interpretation. With that said, let me remind you that the name ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. But technically speaking, they call themselves the Islamic State. In other words, they dropped the Iraq and Syria, and I will show you a couple of maps to explain to you why did they do such a thing. Because the most important thing for ISIS is to dominate globally, not necessarily just in a regional area. In order for us to understand this, we must really look at this map that represents Islamic expansion since the 6th century all the way to the 7th century. I would say during the 6th all the way to the end of the 7th century. Islam, of course, emerged in the early 7th century. And the Arabian Peninsula, as you can see it right here, never actually had any basically religion other than idolatry. And as a result of this, when Islam came into the scene, it began to expand. And here you can see basically with these arrows that originally during the life of the Prophet, the dark brown, which is in the western region of the Arabian Peninsula and also that portion in modern day Oman, all of that was what is called the prototype for the Islamic State. By the time the Prophet of Islam died, that was the original Islamic State. From there, Islam began to expand under the early righteous caliphate era, and then the Umayyad, and then the Abbasides, and it kept going until it covered all of these territories. Of course, there is Islamic view in the caliphate and a Sunni view in the caliphate, Shia and Sunni. Islamic view is represented by these two dominant branches of Islam. You have the Sunni view that will tell you that the start of the caliphate took place during the reign of the first 4 righteous caliphs who were also the companions of the Prophet. Abu Bakr as the first one, the second was Umar, the third one is called Uthman, and the fourth one is Ali. Shia, on the other hand, they only consider Ali to be the first righteous caliph. He's also, according to the Twelvers, which is one dominant branch under Shia Islam, that he's the first imam out of those 12 imams, and all of the other imams come from his lineage, basically. Here is also the model for the Islamic State. The very original model was the Prophet of Islam in the 7th century, and of course he was protected by his uncle Abu Talib. And then you have Muhammad influencing school of interpretation of Sharia law known as the Hanbali school, is the ultra-conservative school, which also later influenced someone by the name Ibn Taymiyyah, a prominent Islamic, basically, apologist, Islamic theologian, and Islamic philosopher, basically, of his day, who lived during the 13th, 14th century. And Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, and his writing and his teaching made a huge impact on many of the modern Islamic Reformation movement, such as the Wahhabi movement, and the Wahhabi also contributed to the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood and its teaching. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, contributed to the rise of more radical wings led by Sayyid Qutb. And then Sayyid Qutb, of course, was one of those leaders who influenced someone like bin Laden, who founded Al-Qaeda later. And Al-Qaeda, of course, out of whom or which basically ISIS was birthed. The point behind this is to show you that they all influence one another, and the model at the end of the day goes all the way back to the 7th century. These are the three main sources for the caliphate because they have to practice the Islamic law. They draw from the Quran, the word of Allah, which is divine. Then you have the hadith, the saying of Muhammad, which is inspired. And then you have the biography and the life of Muhammad as the guide and the role model. Now, there are various views in terms of what ISIS is. You have the moderate view who will tell you Islam is a peaceful religion in every way possible, even its teachings. The jihadis have basically hijacked Islam and hijacked the passages of the Quran and reinterpreted according to their own misunderstandings. However, they are the silent majority. I call them the silent enablers because out of fear, they remain silent. They do not push back against the interpretation of people like ISIS, even though they represent majority of Muslims. Then you have the moderate reformer, and here I'm not talking about religious reformer, I'm talking about moderate Muslim culture and Muslim reformers who really have every intent to try to reinterpret certain aspects of Islam and Sharia law, do away with things that are inhumane and do not apply to 21st century, give more rights to minorities and to women, and at the same time, they also believe that the jihadis have hijacked Islam, but this group is a minority group, and they themselves also are at risk by not only the ultra-conservative group like ISIS, but even sometimes the majority Islamic community can reject this particular group as well, because they feel that this group is kind of like straying away from the mainstream Islam. Then you get the minority who are the ultra-conservative minority in terms of like being 5 to 10% of the Muslim world, but they are the most dominant, most powerful, most influential group. And this is the ISIS group. They are the one that wants to reestablish the 7th century Islam. That's why it is called the Reformed movement. It's, in their view, the moderate and the moderate reformers and the liberals and the Shia and the non-Muslims, all of those are considered to be infidels. In fact, they call Muslims who are hypocrites, who are non-practicing Muslims, to be infidels as well. They go all the way to the 7th century that they call the early Salaf, basically model, meaning the generation of the Prophet, his companion, and their followers. And they also call it the prophetic method, meaning the way of the Prophet. And they are the boldest and the fearless minority. Causes for radicalization. Many times I get asked, what would cause someone to become radical? Well, there are so many seeds that usually are planted in the mind of this person. Either the person just converted to Islam and immediately someone began to disciple them using the violent verses and also at the same time incorporating many of the propaganda similar to things like this, or they grew up Muslims but nominal and all of a sudden realized the need to belong to the other basically religious groups who also will feed them this propaganda. In their mind, the ultra-conservative group, the radical group, will tell the other Muslims that the world of Islam is becoming more hypocritical. They're becoming more rebellious against God's law. They're straying away from the straight path. They're being influenced by the West and Western values, and they're losing their Islamic values as a result of this. They also will use the disunity among the Islamic communities as another example. They blame it typically on colonialism. They blame also wars by the Crusaders. Yes, they go all the way back to the year 1091 when the Crusader campaigns started at that time. All the way from 91, of course, until 1200 AD. Then you have the model of the Salaf, that's the 7th century Islam. They will also blame current Islamic leaders to be corrupt leaders. and they have this tendency to call the other Muslims to liberate themselves from under this corrupt leader, because they also get the impression, or give the impression to others, that there is this perceived persecution by those leaders against righteous Muslims, and they tend to consider other Islamic groups to be heretical. Then there is this radical call, the call for jihad. And obviously, from their point of view, jihad is a personal obligation. Every Muslim have been humiliated, in their view, at the hands of impure Muslim regimes and Western colonial powers. Islam, as a result of this, will suffer ultimate defeat if Muslims do not take on jihad as a personal obligation. And that will cause the reestablishment of caliphate, and that would be the ultimate goal for restoration of the Islamic faith and Islamic power. So what is the caliphate? Caliphate is an Arabic word for khilafah, or succession. It's a form of Islamic political religious leadership which centers around an individual called the caliph, khalifa in Arabic, who is the successor. Successor of whom? Successor of the Prophet of Islam. In other words, since the inception of Islam in 610 AD and after the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, every righteous Muslim leader is a caliph because he is succeeding the model of the Prophet. In other words, this will continue until Judgment Day. That's basically what the caliphate aims for. Conceptually, a caliphate represents a sovereign, boundaryless state of the entire Muslim faithful community known as Ummah. Now, what are the duties of the caliph? The duties of the caliph, for instance, I'm going to use Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the caliph for the Islamic State, ISIS, to safeguard the original pure form of Islam against any innovations or heresies, the 7th century model against any other Islamic models today. His calling is universal. Basically, he has the global duty, universal duty to defend the rights of Muslims everywhere. So, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who technically resides somewhere in the territories of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, launches basically a war in France or in the UK or other parts of the world, he's doing it because he has this universal obligation to defend the rights of Muslims. He also is the one that will call on organized jihad against any and all non-Muslim states and hypocrite Muslims as well. He have the duty to govern globally. Therefore, just because he happens to be in Raqqa, Syria, doesn't mean his law and his ruling does not apply to Muslims who live in other parts of the world. If they're willing to pledge an allegiance to him, this is one other essential thing why many of these so-called lone wolves, they're not alone, trust me, but let's use that terminology. Usually they pledge an allegiance to him. In other words, they are obeying his calling and his command for them to fight against others, even if those others happen to be, in their view, hypocrite Muslims. And his duty also encompasses the protection of minority Muslim groups and non-Muslims also. The minority non-Muslims like the Christians or Jews, if this group is willing to pay an allegiance to the Islamic State and be willing to pay jizya or head tax for protection. Now, this is just a look at a historical timeline for the Islamic Caliphate since its inception in 632 all the way until today. Basically, the pinnacle of that is what we know today since 2014 as ISIS. This is just to show you that there is always a consecutive, basically, process for these Islamic states to continue and to go from one stage to another, from one year to another, from one dynasty to another. In other words, this is a continuous movement that should not stop. Obviously, one of the frustrations that the groups like ISIS would use is that, in their view, since the end of World War I in 1924, the last Islamic Caliphate was the Ottoman Empire, and since then, in their view, there is no Islamic caliphate that existed, and therefore they are bringing it back now into existence. I want you to see, for instance, using these images, how the Islamic caliphate expanded. Since 632, this is the green area, until 661. Then from 661 all the way until 750, you would see the additional colors, which is the light green, along with the blue and the red. And finally, you get something called the Abbasid Caliphate or dynasty, which is basically a collection of united caliphate. It wasn't like a one boundaryless, basically, caliphate. It was a collection of multiple caliphates under the headship of a main caliph in Baghdad. And then after that, we get the Ottoman Empire, which continued in Eastern Europe also, and then began to shrink gradually until the end of World War I in 1924. Here's another thing also about the caliphate. They follow a specific model usually for government. There is a specific structure. You have the caliph. You have also the House of Representatives called Al-Shura or Majlis Al-Shura, the Council of Advisors. And then you have an assistant or a deputy caliph. And then you have other departments. Now, I want you to take a good look at this model and then take a look at the ISIS model. Almost the same, because they follow exactly those kind of models that are taught in early Islam. Here is some things also about ISIS and some of the things that fuel the movement. For instance, the Quran actually talks about the caliphate. In chapter 24, verse 55, it calls the people of God to be his representatives. Here's what it says. God has promised those of you who have attained to faith. Notice, you have to be faithful and do righteous deeds. That of certainty, there is an assurance, he will make them khulafa. And I highlighted this because the word here, not in a singular, it's in a plural. In other words, you will continue to be my representative on earth. Even as he caused some of those who lived before them to become khulafa, and that of a certainty, he will firmly establish for them the religion which he has been pleased to bestow on them, and that of a certainty. So there were caliphs before the rise of Islam, but now it's only the religion of Islam that has this righteous right to continue this movement until Judgment Day. According to the teaching of the Prophet of Islam, here is a tradition that the Prophet supposedly said. You can find it in Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, in Mishkat al-Masabih, chapter Al-Inzar wa Tahzir. In other words, this chapter is known as the warning chapter. This is what it says. The Messenger of Allah says, prophethood will remain among you as long as Allah wills. Then caliphate on the lines of the prophethood shall commence and remain as long as Allah wills. Then corrupt, erosive monarchies would take place, and it will remain as long as Allah wills. After that, despotic kingship would emerge, and it will remain as long as Allah wills. Then the caliphate shall come once again based on the precept of prophethood. ISIS believe that they are the fulfillment of this prophecy that is found in the red line. There are, of course, some basically explanation that this particular tradition could have been fabricated at a certain time. Nevertheless, it exists in the pages of the Islamic sources. ISIS believes that they are the fulfillment of this particular tradition. Here's another thing related to the caliphate. There is a connection between the caliphate and end times. And here is one of those traditions that talks about that. Jabir ibn Samra, based on Nafi' ibn Utbah, reports that the Prophet said, supposedly, you will march against or attack the Arabian Peninsula, and Allah will open or allow you to conquer it. Then Persia, and Allah will allow you to conquer it. Then you will march against the Romans, that's the Western world basically, and Allah will allow you to conquer it. Then you will march against the Dajjal, that's the Antichrist, indicating the end time and the preparation for the coming of Jesus as a Muslim prophet. And Allah will allow you to conquer or defeat him. Then Nafi' or Jabir said to Jabir, O Jabir, we will not see the Dajjal emerge until the Roman land has been conquered by Allah for the Muslims. In other words, until we take over the West, then the end will come. And that's again one of those traditions that ISIS uses to fuel those so-called attacks and suicide bomb and terror operations. This particular tradition can be found in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Ibn Majah. And now let's connect end times to both views, the Sunni version of events and the Shia version of events. According to ISIS's view, or the Sunni view, the end times will happen this way. There's the importance. There is something about the area where they add Dabiq or Raqqa in Syria. They will conquer Arabia, Persia, Turkey, Europe, Greece, and Rome, spreading globally. Then there'll be a coming of Antichrist. Many times they think it's coming from the east. And then the final battle will take place in the so-called Dabiq or Raqqa. That's why ISIS is still holding on. They feel like they are doing what they were promised. And then after that, the Mahdi or the guided one will appear, preparing the way for the second coming of Christ. Christ will become the global ruler after he basically fights and defeats the non-Muslims, and those who refuse to convert from Christians and Jews and others will be killed by him. He will rule and he will get married, died, and then everybody will be judged, including Christ himself. And then there is the Shia version of events. They believe that the first Imam is Ali, and then there is the 12th Imam has been raptured. He is the Mahdi, raptured in 874 AD, and he's hiding now, and he guides their Ayatollahs basically, and they are preparing for his second coming. The only difference is, like in Shia philosophy or theology, that they can expedite his second coming whenever there is a fighting and chaos against the enemies of God. And the rules basically of this Mahdi are happening right now through the Ayatollahs who are his representative, and he returns basically to make the final hour basically fulfilled. The Shia, of course, are in control of expediting his return according to their own understanding. Now, let us take a look basically at this map of modern-day ISIS. The orange part is the territories that are still, technically speaking, under ISIS's leadership, although they're beginning to lose most of this ground. But when they changed their name from ISIS to Islamic State, they really expanded the vision to include the Sham. That's why they called them Daesh, meaning the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, or Levant. That will include Jordan, Lebanon, and will include portions of the Sinai Peninsula, most of Iraq, and portions of Iran and Turkey as well. But the ultimate goal for the Islamic State really is to resemble the original Golden Age, which is on your right-hand side of the screen. ISIS's map is the dark black map. Notice how they are almost identical. In other words, ISIS want to revive what was lost. And here is, once again, Dr. Bill Warner, a friend of ours, who has his ministry called the Center for Islamic Politics, have done a number of surveys by analyzing some of the teachings that are found in what he called the trilogy, which is the Hadith, the saying of Muhammad, CIRA, the life of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and also the teaching of the Quran. And he's discovered that the emphasis on jihad are so high, almost 67%, when you study the biography of the Prophet of Islam, versus it's taught only in 24% of the Quran, simply in the Medina Quran, basically, and finally 21% of the Hadith. You can see that the model of the Prophet is the one that fuels all of those attacks. So, what have we learned from all of this? If we were to combine ISIS and Sharia together, we would learn that ISIS's ultimate goal is simply this: to create a unified Muslim territory, Muslim Ummah, in order to enforce its extremist beliefs, to enforce strict Sharia law, to play a key role in an impending apocalypse. How can ISIS reach this goal? through the establishment of the Islamic State, which is the Caliphate, recruitment of other willing Muslims, and the implementation of Sharia law. I hope you find this series to be beneficial to you and to your organizations, to your groups, and your church. You can always get a hold of me if you want me to teach on these topics and others in person. The way to connect with me is through my website, CIRAinternational.com. You can watch this on that website and also through our YouTube channel, also known as CIRA International. Until we meet again, have a blessed day. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you will be notified of new videos.